Thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I am here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Recently, the federal government allowed a key Canadian company, New Lithium Corporation, to pass into Chinese hands without a national security review. This $960 million deal is a go, despite Ottawa designating lithium as a critical mineral. Here to discuss is Dr. Wesley Wark. He is a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and welcome to Boom and Bust.
Thank you, Tony. Great to be with you.
First of all, maybe tell us what you know about this Neo Lithium company and what this proposed deal is.
So Neo Lithium is a company based in Canada. It trades on the Toronto Stock Exchange. It's developing an interesting sounding asset, a lithium mine in Argentina. And lithium, for your listeners who may not be familiar with this more or less invisible mineral, is a key component, in all future economies because it's critical to the development of usable electric batteries to drive cars and all kinds of other things. So it's really a strategic asset. It's been regarded by the Canadian government as a strategic asset. We're looking at plans in Canada, that is the government is, to try and see how it can, develop its mineral capacities. We certainly have untapped resources in that regard and think about processing and think about working with the United States. So in that context, thinking about the importance of lithium, it's very surprising to me that the government decided not to do a formal national security review on this takeover.
Yeah, and I guess the CEO of Neo Lithium, to give him his day in court here, has said, look at this is about a mine in Argentina. It's not a mine in Canada. Therefore, it shouldn't be part of the national security review, even though it's a Canadian company. Is that sort of their counter argument, I guess?
Well, it is their counter argument. I don't think it holds any water. I can understand why the company is anxious to allow this takeover to proceed. It probably is good for their for their pocketbook. But the reality is that a Canadian company possesses not just overseas assets, in this case, a mine in Argentina. It also possesses future possibilities that will go unexplored in terms of Canadian interest if this takeover is allowed to happen. And most importantly of all, it possesses invisible assets, intangible assets, particularly intellectual property, technological know-how. All of that leaves Canada. And, to be honest, Tony, we're not at this stage in a good place in terms of our ability to really map the capacity to mine, extract, process lithium in Canada, something we're going to have to get to grips with. And simply to let companies go into foreign hands, particularly into the hands of a state-owned enterprise, a Chinese state-owned enterprise, I just don't think is good for the Canadian economy.
Understood. What do you know about the Chinese acquirer? It's a state-owned enterprise. Is that what you just said?
Yeah, it is a state-owned enterprise, but these come in many shapes and sizes in a Chinese context. It's a company that began as a pretty small-scale mining operation in China. It was initially focused on gold mining, but it's one of these Chinese companies that's really engaged in a kind of very fast-paced global expansion. It now owns mines around the world, including in Serbia, in Africa, in Australia, in South America. And it's expanded beyond its initial interest in mining gold into other critical minerals, including lithium and other key minerals for the new economy. So it's a major Chinese concern now. It's state-owned in the sense that it is its largest shareholder is a Chinese provincial government. Okay. But in the context of the reach of the Chinese Communist Party, the fact that a Chinese provincial government is essentially the key stakeholder in this company means that it is certainly subject to Chinese government influence and direction.
If you're a Chinese company, you're mandated to look out for the interests of the Chinese Communist Party at the same time.
That's absolutely right, and China has passed in recent years some pretty striking espionage legislation, which really compels companies to to provide it with information that the Chinese government might regard as important to its national security when it's operating abroad. This has been a controversy with regard to Huawei, for example, which is subject to the same Chinese laws. So any Chinese company, whether it's state-owned or not state-owned, and a firm operating in that kind of milieu in terms of the Chinese government's outlook and sort of centralized command and control of its economy, presents, I think, particularly challenges when it invests in Canada.
Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Wesley Wark. He is a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Wesley, I know this might be in the dumb question category, but again, trying to educate the viewers a little bit. Is this part of a general strategy by the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government to acquire a commanding position in supply chains for critical minerals?
I think the answer to that has to be yes. I mean, we don't have a sort of formal pronouncement along those lines by the Chinese government, kind of completely laying out in public their strategic plans. But all kinds of initiatives, from the Belt and Road Initiative to the championing of key industrial concerns in China and their global expansion, all of that suggests that the Chinese government is determined to kind of reach the commanding heights of the global economy, and in particular to position itself as a global leader in certain key technological fields. And it's identified, electric vehicles and artificial intelligence and quantum computing and other really of the sort of front end of technological change as things that they want China to be a global leader in. So yes, there is a clear Chinese governmental interest in driving their economy in that direction.
Right. And let's take it from the other side then. What is the state of the global supply chain when it comes to critical minerals like lithium?
The state of the global supply chain is that most countries, other than China, have been asleep at the switch. Yeah. And that includes Canada and the United States. We were used to be global open trading partners. That's our sense of the global economy that, reigned for so long. And I think we've been slow to understand, the kind of activities that have been undertaken by China and Chinese companies, the ways in which they have really zeroed in their attention on key components of the new economy, if you like, whether it's telecommunications, critical minerals, whatever, new research endeavors in artificial intelligence. And so I think it's fair to say we're playing catch up. And I think that more sober voices will suggest that there's no reason to despair at our ability to catch up in the West. We have advanced societies, advanced technological capacity, but the longer you put off catching up, the more difficult it becomes. And I think this is really a critical part of the discussion about this particular company, the Lithium Takeover. I just don't see that we should be in the business of allowing, a foreign takeover of one of the key elements of the new economy. I think we just really have to start thinking hard about seizing control of some of these assets for Canada and for Canadian interests.
Yeah, how would we go about doing that? You mentioned seizing control. I mean, the fact of the matter is that, let me just preface it by saying this. Canada, touts the fact that they want to be, that Canadians and Canada should be part of the new green economy, but it's kind of hard to be part of the new green economy if you don't have control over your lithium supply chain. So what are the methods by which we can reverse that?
Well, I think there's two things that can be done. I mean, the biggest need, I think, is for Canada to come up with something that we haven't thought about needing or having for a very long time, which is essentially an industrial policy. So, we have to decide what is the role of the government going forward in creating new economic circumstances, driving our economy in the direction that it assures that we have access to, key minerals, key supply chains that we'll need in the future. I think, to be honest, COVID-19 and some of the impacts on supply chains have been a real wake-up call for all Canadians, for the government, leading us to recognize that we may need this kind of industrial policy. And when we think in particular about critical minerals and things like lithium, I think one of the things we're going to have to consider is going back to, frankly, Tony, a conservative playbook, where in the aftermath of a controversial acquisition of an oil sands company way back when,
Right.
the Harper government decided, and you'll probably remember that, well, maybe we shouldn't let this kind of thing happen in the future. So we essentially, that is, the government ring-fenced all oil sands production facilities and said, we're not going to allow foreign direct investment into the Canadian oil sands. Okay, well, that was, I think, a decent undertaking, and it was very, very clear to the world. We weren't trying to cut off Canada from all foreign investment. We were just saying this is a particularly sensitive sector. I think we need to start thinking about doing the same thing with regard to critical minerals. So start to ring fence those where we have a real capacity ourselves to mine them, to extract them, to process them, to use them.
We're going to continue this very important discussion with Dr. Wesley Wark after the break. Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Wesley Wark. He is a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Wesley, we're talking a little bit about what should be done, maybe in this case of Lithium, but also in the future as well. Maybe take our audience a little bit through what exactly is a national security review and how it would have applied in this case or indeed in future cases.
Sure, Tony, I'm happy to do that. And it's a complex process, and I think little known to Canadians, understandably. But essentially, national security review happens under something called the Investment Canada Act. And it's a process that's run by a particular department in the federal government, the Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada Department. So there's a governance structure for it. And national security review really happens in two stages. There's an initial stage where all foreign direct investment, it doesn't matter of what scale or size, is scrutinized by a committee, including representatives from Canada's security and intelligence agencies, to see if there are identifiable national security concerns about an investment. But there are hundreds, of course, of such investments, nearly 1,000 per year. So it's a huge burden of work, and for the overstretched officials to be able to identify key ones, I'm sure is a real challenge. The process is meant to work that in this way, that after that initial review by a committee, including intelligence officials, then that committee provides advice to the minister and cabinet saying, yes, we think formal cabinet-based national security review of longer duration, more intensive, should take place or not. It's purely advisory. At the end of the day, this is a cabinet decision. And cabinet has the powers under a section of the Investment Canada Act to order a formal national security review. It's called Section 25.3 of the Investment Canada Act. The advantages of doing that, and you don't want to do it in every case, obviously, you want to restrict it to the most important cases, but I think this was one. The advantages are numerous of doing that kind of thing when you feel you need to. One is that you have much more time to think about the details of an investment and its impact on Canada and national security. You have the capacity, because you have more time, to consult with allies, and that's often very important when you're talking about global supply chains and critical minerals. And I think above all, you bring into play, senior decision makers in Ottawa. You get cabinet ministers around a table having to think through these issues and make what is and should be at the end of the day a political decision. So I think with these kinds of investments, where there is something important to stake, and where the Minister for ISED, Investment, Science and Economic Development Canada, has himself said in guidelines that were released in March 2021 that critical minerals are part of the thing that they want to look at when they scrutinize foreign direct investment, as well as state-owned companies. When all of that is already kind of in place, I think you have to take these particular kinds of investments where we're looking at the new economy and things that really are going to matter for Canada and in an allied context, and really subject them to the longer duration, proper national security review.
Well, it's got to be a bit of a head scratcher for you then, and for others too, because national security concerns, critical minerals identified as an an area where national security is important, and yet no review in this case.
Yeah, it is a head scratcher. I can't quite figure it out. I mean, I think the best explanation is that officials involved working, at speed in difficult circumstances, many of them working at home, remotely, had to think about this file. And one of the things that they had to take into account was the fact that the company that is taking over, Lithium, has previously and recently, in the last couple of years, acquired a couple of other Canadian mining companies without any controversy being raised.
Oh.
So there was a kind of precedent there. They bought gold mining firms in Canada, not critical mineral firms, because gold is not at this stage at least considered a critical mineral, but it has a track record. And perhaps they felt that, well, that was a precedent that they had to follow. But I think the important calculation, I'm guessing on this, of course, but the important calculation was probably, well, this is a company that has an asset overseas, so it's really not critical to Canadian national security. That's just a big mistake. The key issue is, I think, intellectual property, technological know-how, and trying to keep companies that have, invested in developing intellectual property and technological know-how working in Canada under Canadian ownership.
Well, the horse is out of the barn, as they say in the business, so we'll have to wait to see how the test is applied in future cases. We've got one more segment with our guest, Dr. Wesley Wark. He is a senior fellow at the Canadian Centre for International Governance Innovation. We'll be right back after these messages. Please stay with us. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Wesley Wark. He is a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. Wesley, is Canada taking seriously its national security threats posed by the Chinese government, do you think?
Well, that's a good question, Tony. And I would say I'm not sure that we're yet taking them completely seriously. I think we're trying to come to grips with them. We're really having to pivot in this country, as is the case with many of our close allies, to a pretty radically changed threat environment where we have to be concerned by things like pandemics, by things like climate change, security impacts, technological disruption, and above all, have to start thinking about economic insecurity. I mean, I think this is going to be a big driver of national security policy going forward. So we've tended to take, with regard to national security review, a kind of case-by-case approach, which I don't think, which can mean that we don't have a strategic framework for thinking about these issues. I think that's the real problem. I think we're going to have to apply a real strategic framework and stop thinking about this as a kind of, case by case, we'll decide this way and this one and that way and another one. And also to, keep in mind, with the whole point of national security review is not necessarily to completely disallow foreign direct investment. There's lots of flexibility in the Act to create conditions, impose conditions, and mitigations on foreign direct investments so that you can maintain your stature as an open global trading economy while still trying to protect your interests. So I think for those reasons, where you have critical asset takeovers in Canada, it's always good to take the time, do a proper review, give yourself time to think about, can we mitigate this foreign investment, which at the end of the day may be good for Canada if we can keep it, within conditions that are helpful to the Canadian economy. But if you rush through the initial review period, there's a limit of 45 days on that, and you can't quite decide what to do next and just let it go. I just think that's the wrong kind of policy.
And you mentioned, and this is absolutely true, at the end of the day, it is the politician, the minister reporting to cabinet that makes the ultimate decision on these things. So there is some political accountability there. And it's the same federal government that did sign a memorandum of understanding with the U.S. government on critical minerals, mining, and technology to make it basically an industry of interest when it comes to supply chains and national security. And yet we don't see any of those at play here.
Yeah, again, it's one of the puzzles in this particular, in the case of the Lithium takeover. And we've been working with the United States since 2019 on kind of trying to secure critical mineral supply chains and think about joint action with the United States. That's not to say that Canadian policy will be dictated by the United States, but we have interests in common, clearly, and it'd be good to work with the United States. who knows what attention Washington is paying to this particular takeover among many, but it just sends the wrong signal,
Right,
I think.
right. Do you think this will have an impact on Canada-US relationship then?
Not necessarily this one case, but if it looks to be setting a pattern where we're saying one thing, that we take critical minerals seriously and understand the fragilities of the supply chain, but on the other hand, do nothing to try and advance Canadian interests, that will certainly send the wrong message.
Are you yourself keeping an eye on other potential foreign investment reviews, or are you kind of reacting to what you hear about?
Well, as you'll know, Tony, the way this works, it's quite a secretive process, so that national security review matters are really only communicated to the parties involved in an investment, the party that wants to do a takeover and the party that's subject to a takeover. And the government doesn't release much in the way of details about its consideration. So inevitably, I think commentators are forced to be reactive, although you can always add the spice of suggestion that we need to be more strategic about this going forward.
We're out of time, but keep scouring those press releases. Dr. Wesley Wark, thanks for joining our program today.
Thank you, Tony. Great pleasure. Thank you.
Well, there you have it, Dr. Wesley Wark. Some real bells ringing there, warning bells, really, about potential hostile takeovers of Canadian companies from strategic interests within the Communist Party of China. So we'll continue to watch this file, as I think Dr. Wark will do as well. Thanks for watching today.